Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
Greetings, family, and welcome back to Raising the Vibe. Thank you for joining me for another video. As always, I ask that you like this video and subscribe to the channel. So today we'll be doing our third installment in the Big Book of Secrets series. So of course, we'll be looking at David Icke's book, The Biggest Secret. And even though it's our third installment, we're actually going to be looking at chapter 2 today because we've done the introduction in chapter 1 already. And chapter 2 is called Don't Mention the Reptiles. Now, of course, back when Icke wrote this book in the 1990s, we were not as familiar with the possibility that there may be reptilian creatures on this earth. But since then, we've seen it in cartoons, we've seen it in movies. Those of you who watched my video on Denver International Airport have seen a bit of it in modern day real life. And so this isn't really as surprising or astonishing as it would have been back in the 90s. And because this whole notion of reptilians is so central to what David Icke believes and how he views things on this earth, I'm actually going to go through this chapter in some detail so that you have a really clear grasp of it and you're able to understand as we move forward to different chapters. So the chapter starts with the basic premise that we touched on last time, which is that humanity was seeded by extraterrestrials and there is a reptilian race that controls the planet and has done so for thousands of years and continues to do so today. In David Icke's mind, that reptilian race is the Anunnaki, which we have also previously discussed. It is his position that there were and continue to be other ET, extraterrestrial, races on the planet. And when we spoke previously about the wars of the gods between the various factions of the Anunnaki, he suggests that some of those wars of the gods may also have been between the different reptilian races. So prior to writing this book, Icke had met with a number of people who claimed to have seen reptilians on Earth. And he was able to, based on those accounts, provide a description. He says that they're much taller than humans and that they're cold-blooded, like some of the reptiles that are on Earth. He said that they are less emotionally sensitive than humans and that some of them have great difficulty expressing love, although they are very intelligent and have advanced technology. And according to David Icke, that is an excellent description of the attitudes and behaviors of the brotherhood that controls the planet today. He points out that these descriptions of reptiles matched up very well with accounts that we see in both ancient texts as well as we hear about in legend. Icke reminds us that fire-breathing dragons and evil serpents appear in ancient texts and legends all throughout the world. He starts with our basic story of the Garden of Eden, where a serpent tempted Eve and then provided the humans with spiritual or additional information that otherwise wasn't available to them. He does a survey of various cultures and says that our story is not the only one like that many cultures have a story with a sacred space that is guarded by a fire-breathing dragon, or stories where reptilian-like creatures provided spiritual information to humans. David Icke says that the reptilians have a long-standing connection to the earth. He even traces it back to the dinosaurs, some of whom looked reptilian and seemed to be cold-blooded. And he points us to the Draco dragon constellation, noting that many of the ancient monuments on Earth are aligned with that constellation, including, of course, the pyramids in Egypt. Ike also mentions an armored lizard called Moloch, which you may have heard from in the Bible. And he notes that Moloch is an ancient deity to which children were sacrificed. And if you remember in the Bible, that was that big statue with the hole in the middle and the burning flames that they would throw their children into. And David Icke says that children are still being sacrificed to that deity today in satanic rituals. And he says that many of these quote unquote demons of Satan are the reptilian race that control the world to this day and continue to engage in that satanic practice. Now, I'm just going to insert that as horrible and outrageous as that sounds, I think we all have heard about human sacrifice and have heard allegations that that continues to take place today. Just a side note. David Icke attempts to provide theoretical bases for where these Anunnaki or where the reptilian creatures come from. He has 3 theories and he says they all apply. Number 1 is that they are extraterrestrial, meaning they came from somewhere outside of this planet. Number 2, that they are interterrestrials, which live inside the earth. So like if you've heard stories of the hollow core or Admiral Byrd's journeys to Antarctica, which is just opening up whole other lines of conversation that we will talk about later. But the point being that there are some theories that within the actual earth, as you move toward the core of the earth, there are entities that live there. And then the third theory that he has is that these reptilian races manipulate humans from another dimension. In particular, he's referring to the lower 4th dimension. He uses that phrase, the lower 4th dimension, repeatedly in this chapter. And according to Icke, these ETs come from all 3 places, from beyond the earth, from within the earth, and from this lower 4th dimension. He notes that modern humans still have a portion of the brain that is called the reptilian brain. And I imagine most of us have heard that as well. He says that this is an ancient, prehistoric portion of our brain. And Ike notes that the reptilian portion of the brain is known to be correlated with aggressive behavior, territoriality, ritualism, and the establishment of social hierarchies. And he says that these are precisely the behavior patterns of the reptilians he talks about in his book. So as an interesting side note, David Icke talks about the astronomer Carl Sagan and says that Carl Sagan knew way more than he ever let on, although sometimes he would let out a bit of truth. For example, when Carl Sagan told us that we would do well as humans to understand the reptilian component of human behavior because it would help us to understand what human beings are all about. Okay? David Icke notes that in one of his books, Carl Sagan indicated that the negative aspects of human behavior are often given reptilian terms, such as cold-blooded killer, for example. And then finally, something which is really interesting, David Icke points out that Sagan, spelled backwards, is Nagas, which is the spelling of the East Indian reptilian gods. Pretty interesting, huh? David Icke talks in this chapter about the many people he had met who said that they saw people shapeshift into reptilians and shapeshift back. And there's an interesting side note. I just read recently some information on the internet and saw some videos where people were saying that they've seen Justin Bieber shapeshift into a reptilian. I mean, I don't know. Just another interesting side note. So David Icke has talked to psychics and all kind of other people to investigate this reptilian theory. And they have come to the conclusion that most of the people in power appear to be reptilians. And although there are some humans who are in power, they are overshadowed by and controlled by reptilians. So Ike talks about a number of ways that human-looking people are actually reptilians. There are 3 ways that he mentions. Number 1 is full-blooded reptilians, and they would use a human body to disguise the fact that they're actually reptilian. 2 is like what we would call being possessed, and I think that's what they're referring to when they talked about humans in power who were overshadowed and controlled by reptilians. And then he talks about hybrids who are reptilian human crossbreed bloodlines that are controlled by reptilians from the 4th dimension. So, not to put too fine of a point on that, but Ike tells us that the leading brotherhood families, including the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, the Windsors, those are full-blooded reptilians wearing human physical bodies is like an overcoat. Literally, he says, quote, wearing human physical bodies like an overcoat, end quote. David Icke also uses the example of the couple Bill and Hillary Clinton to point out to us that the person in power is not always the one with the highest ranking in these reptilian families, and that as between Bill and Hillary, Hillary actually ranked higher, and Bill was like a crossbreed who was more like a pawn to be used and discarded, with Hillary behind the scenes actually pulling the strings. So that's interesting. And nowadays, many of us know that the ruling class often reveals in movies the truth. And so David Icke mentions a number of movies that I'm going to mention in case you want to explore them further. They include a movie called The Arrival, which he says is about a reptile ET race that takes over the planet by operating through human bodies and appearing to be human. He also mentioned that movie They Live, which had a similar theme, which some of you may be familiar with. I believe that's the movie where the actor put on the glasses and then he was able to see words like obey, consume, all that kind of thing. But when you take them off, you don't see them. He also mentions Alien Resurrection. And he also mentions a 1980s American television series called V, which he says came the closest to telling the truth of any of these fictional depictions. He mentions a number of other movies as well, but these are the ones that I'm going to highlight. And he also mentions the Denver International Airport. And he said that that's reputed to be a cover for a deep underground reptilian human base. Oh, and with regard to the gargoyles that we saw in the Denver International Airport, he says that gargoyles are symbols of the reptilians, and he said that gargoyles are seen on the stately homes of the reptilian rulers in Europe, as well as on the churches and great cathedrals of Europe. So he's trying to give us support in things we see every day for his idea that reptilians have seeded humans, are in control of the planet, and have been in control of the planet for a very long time. According to David Icke, there are many breeds and crossbreeds of reptilians. He mentions the Draco, and he says the elite are known by the UFO researchers to be the Draco. He said that the Dracos have wings and that the fallen angels and the gargoyles, which are winged, are symbols of the Draco. Very interestingly, he says that Count Dracula was a Draco, a depiction of a Draco. He said that the cape worn by Count Dracula was symbolic of the wings of the Draco ETs. And he also said that the character Dracula in the Bram Stoker series is said to be a fallen angel. Who knew? There are a couple of interesting points that Ike mentions in this section. Number one, we've already talked about human sacrifice, especially of children, to Moloch. And he said that these human sacrifices are demanded by the reptilians, and that's why they're done. He also mentions that at the moment of death by sacrifice, a form of adrenaline surges through the body and accumulates at the base of the brain, and that this is apparently most potent in children. So he doesn't mention the term adrenochrome in this book, but nowadays we are familiar with that substance as reportedly being adrenochrome. If you have not heard of that, you may want to look it up. I certainly will do a video at some point on that, but there's so many topics, I can't say exactly when I would get to that. The other interesting point Ike makes in this section is that reptilians are emotionless and lack sentiment, and that they feed off the energy of low vibrational human conditions such as fear, guilt, and aggression. And in this regard, I would only point out that animated movie Monsters was all about this, where those monsters were feeding off loosh, which was energy from humans. So that's another interesting side note. But in this regard, Ike says that the more these low vibrational human energies can be generated and stimulated, the more energy the reptilians have to work with. And he said that's why they're always encouraging wars, human genocide, sexual perversions, the mass slaughter of animals, and black magic and ritual sacrifice, which he says takes place on a staggeringly large scale on this planet. Now, Ike is of the belief that this serpent royalty, serpent king bloodline that is ruling the world today originates from the region of Iran, Kurdistan, Armenia, Turkey, and the Caucasus Mountains. And he said that these reptile human bloodlines emerge from this area to take over the whole world. Now, I don't know how many of you may be familiar with the book of Enoch, which is a book that is not in our current Bible, but there are tons of them. We'll talk about them in another video, the Apocrypha. But for now, we're going to talk about the book of Enoch. And in that book, it speaks of Noah causing concern when he was born.
Because his skin and hair were white, his eyes shone, and he looked like the angels.
Ike further says that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Noah is described as looking like the children of the fallen angels of heaven, whose conception was due to the Watchers and to the Nephilim. All right, so hopefully most of us are already aware of this. There were some Watchers, some angels who watched over humans, and even this is mentioned briefly in Genesis, and saw that the daughters of man were comely and attractive, and took to themselves some of those daughters as wives, and mated with them, and had children who are supposed to be the Nephilim, the giants of old. And Ike says that in Jewish lore, Eve was seen as the ancestral mother of the Nephilim. And I mean, I guess you can connect it because, of course, Eve was supposed to have been tempted by the serpent. And a lot of people, I don't know about a lot of people, but it has been theorized that it wasn't fruit that Eve ate, that was meant to describe sex. If so, that fits with this. I mean, there are all kinds of theories out there about everything, but this is what David Icke is saying. Ike points out that the book of Enoch was banned by the Roman Catholic Church, and that the point of that was to stop us from knowing this truth and from understanding what's really going on this earth and who they really are. And interestingly enough, he says the Freemasons who control the Roman Catholic Church today, along with various branches of the Brotherhood, have always looked to Enoch as one of their legendary founders. Apparently, the name Enoch means initiated. Again, it's been a really long time since I read this book, so some of it in preparing to do this video is just surprising to me. I'm sure that it's part of the database that is in my mind that I use to evaluate things that I encounter, but it's just not at the forefront, and so I just don't specifically remember it, but I certainly am finding it quite interesting. Ike also is of the position, and by the way, I know I keep going back to calling him Ike and Ike. I've always thought of him as David Ike, but I know he calls himself David Ike, so it's best to use the name that he uses, but out of habit, I will still often say Ike. Please forgive me for that. I ask for a bit of grace. But anyway, it is his position that the reptilians have used the white race as their main means of global control. But he says that they have crossbred with all races, including Arabs, Chinese, Japanese, and remember Credo Mutwa? I don't know that I'm pronouncing his name right, but I can see his face, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with him as well. David Icke says that Credo Mutwa said that the black royal lines of Africa claim to be descended from the same gods as the white aristocracy, and that the leaders of Africa today turn out to have those same bloodlines. And I don't doubt it. Look at how they rule Africa. Look at how they repeatedly take the wealth for themselves and their families and leaving the people with nothing, living in poverty and impoverished conditions. I wouldn't doubt it. And Ike notes that by primarily using the white race, but also crossbreeding with all these other races, it allows the reptilians to control people and organizations that appear unconnected, but that actually are of the same bloodline. And the final point that I'm going to make from this chapter about the reptiles, I'm actually going to read, and it says, the book of Enoch says that those born of the Nephilim blood, which according to Ike would be the reptile-human hybrids, are because of their ancestral spirit destined to afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. Now that's a mouthful. And that will do it for installment 3 of our Big Book of Secrets. And as always, I thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time. I look forward to any comments you may wish to share to spark conversation. And until I see you next time, family, peace and love and light.